all of these moments in history, these really traumatic things that we talk about, they didn't happen to some nameless, faceless mass, you know? They happened to people like us, individuals like us who had hopes like we have and fears, and were trying to do the best they could for their children, and, you know, all the same motivations that we have, they have. And so this book is kind of an attempt to show the individuals who are stuck in these extraordinary circumstances, and to bring them to the foreground, and to let us feel them and see them fully as people, and not, you know, not as just like a clump in the middle of slavery.
I am thrilled to welcome you to this evening's event with Yaa Gyasi, who is here to discuss her debut novel, Homegoing. Essentially a novel in stories, it follows the descendants of two half-sisters born in 18th-century Ghana and traces the legacies of colonization and slavery on both sides of the Atlantic.
Homegoing follows the family lineage of two half-sisters. The first half-sister is named Effia, and she is the wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which is a slave fort in Ghana. And her half-sister Esi is kept in the castle as a slave before being sent to America. So each chapter kind of follows a different descendant, interweaves their stories down through the present day. I'm going to read from the fourth chapter of this novel, Ness's chapter. Ness is Esi's daughter, so she's the first person on her side of the line to grow up entirely in America, on a plantation in Alabama. There was no drinking gourd, no spiritual soothing enough to mend a broken spirit. Even the Northern Star was a hoax. Every day, Ness picked cotton under the punishing eye of the southern sun. She had been at Thomas Allen Stockham's Alabama plantation for 3 months. 2 weeks before, she was in Mississippi. A year before that, she was in a place she would only ever describe as hell. Though she had tried, Ness couldn't remember how old she was. Her best guess was 25, but each year since the one when she was plucked from her mother's arms had felt like 10 years. Ness's mother, Esi, had been a solemn, solid woman who was never known to tell a happy story. Even Ness's bedtime stories had been ones about what Esi used to call the big boat. Ness would fall asleep to the images of men being thrown into the Atlantic Ocean like anchors attached to nothing. No land, no people, no worth. In the big boat, Esi said they were stacked 10 high, and when a man died on top of you, his weight would press the pile down like cooks pressing garlic. Ness's mother, called Frowny by the other slaves because she never smiled, used to tell the story of how she had been cursed by a little dove long, long ago. Cursed and sisterless, she would mutter as she swept, left without her mother's stone. When they sold Ness in 1796, Esi's lips had stood in that same thin line. Ness could remember reaching out for her mother, flailing her arms and kicking her legs, fighting against the body of the man who had come to take her away. And still, Esi's lips had not moved. Her hands had not reached out. She stood there, solid and strong, the same as Ness had always known her to be. And though Ness had met warm slaves on other plantations, Black people who smiled and hugged and told nice stories, she would always miss the gray rock of her mother's heart. She would always associate real love with a hardness of spirit. Thomas Allen Stockham was a good master, if such a thing existed. He gave them 5-minute breaks every 3 hours, and the field slaves were allowed onto the porch to receive 1 mason jar full of water from the house slaves. This day, in late June, Ness waited in line for water beside Tim Tam. He was a gift to the Stockham family from their neighbors, the Whitmans, and Tom Allen often liked to say that Tim Tam was the best gift he'd ever received, better even than the gray-tailed cat his brother had given him for his 5th birthday, or the red wagon he'd received for his 2nd. "How's your day been?" Tim Tam asked. Ness turned toward him just slightly. Ain't all days the same? Tim Tam laughed, a sound that rumbled like thunder built from the cloud of his gut and expelled through the sky of his mouth. I suppose you're right, he said. Ness was not certain she would ever get used to hearing English spill out of the lips of Black people. In Mississippi, Esi had spoken to her in Twi until their master caught her. He'd given Esi 5 lashes for every Twi word Ness spoke, and when Ness, seeing her battered mother, had become too scared to speak, he gave Esi 5 lashes for each minute of Ness's silence. Before the lashes, her mother had called her Mame, after her own mother, but the master had whipped Esi for that too, whipped her until she cried out, "My goodness," the words escaping her without thought, no doubt picked up from the cook who used to say it to punctuate every sentence. And because those had been the only English words to escape Esi's mouth without her struggling to find them, she believed that what she was saying must have been something divine, like the gift of her daughter, and so that goodness had turned into simply Ness. "Where you coming from?" Tim Tam asked. He chewed the chaffy end of a wheat stalk and spit. "You ask too many questions," Ness said. She turned away. It was her turn to receive water from Margaret, the head house slave, but the woman poured only enough to fill a quarter of the glass. "We ain't got enough today," she said. But Ness could see that the buckets of water on the porch behind her were enough to last a week. Margaret looked at Ness, but Ness got the feeling that she was really looking through her, or rather that she was looking 5 minutes into Ness's past, trying to discern whether or not the conversation Ness had just had with Tim Tam meant that the man was interested in her. Tim Tam cleared his throat. "Now, Margaret," he said, "that ain't no kind of way to treat somebody." Margaret glared at him and plunged her ladle into the bucket, but Ness didn't accept the offering. She walked away, leaving the 2 people to stew. While there may have been a piece of paper declaring that she belonged to Tom Allen Stockham, there was no such paper to shackle her to the whims of her fellow slaves. "You ain't got to be so hard on him," a woman said once Ness resumed her position in the field. The woman seemed older, mid to late 30s, but her back hunched even when she stood up straight. "You new here, so you don't know. Tim Tam done lost his woman long while ago, and he been taking care of little Pinky by himself ever since." Ness looked at the woman. She tried to smile, but she had been born during the days of Esi's unsmiling, and she had never learned how to do it quite right. The corners of her lips always seemed to twitch upward, unwillingly, then fall within milliseconds, as though attached to that sadness that had once anchored her own mother's heart. "Ain't we all done lost someone?" Ness asked. Ness was too pretty to be a field nigger. That's what Tom Allen said to her the day he'd taken her back to his plantation. He'd bought her on good faith from a friend of his in Jackson, Mississippi, who said she was one of the best field hands he'd ever seen, but to make quite sure to only use her in the field. Seeing her, light-skinned, with kinked hair that raced down her back in search of her round shelf of a buttocks, Tom Allen thought his friend must have made some kind of mistake. He pulled out the little outfit he liked for his house niggers to wear, a white button-down with a boat neckline and cap sleeves, a long black skirt attached to a little black apron. He'd had Margaret take Ness into the back room so that she could change into it, and Ness had done what she was told. Margaret, seeing Ness all done up, clutched her hand to her heart and told Ness to wait there. Ness had to press her ear to the wall to hear what Margaret said. "She ain't fit for the house," Margaret told Tom Allen. "Well, let me see her, Margaret. I'm sure I can decide for myself whether or not somebody's fit to work in my own house, now can't I?" "Yes'm," Margaret said. "I reckon you is, but it ain't something you gon' want to see, is what I'm sayin'." Tom Allen laughed. His wife, Susan, came into the room and asked what all the fuss was about. "Why, Margaret's got our new nigger locked up in the back and won't let us see her. Stop this nonsense now and go fetch her here." If Susan was like any of the other master's wives, She must have known that her husband's bringing a new nigger into the house meant she had to pay attention. In this and every other southern county, men's eyes and other body parts had been known to wander. Yes, Margaret, bring the girl so we can see, don't be silly about it. Margaret shrugged her shoulders and went back to the room, and Ness pulled her ear from the wall. Well, you best come out, was all Margaret said. And so Ness did. She walked out to her audience of two, her shoulders bared, as well as the bottom halves of her calves, and when Susan Stockham saw her, she fainted outright. It was all Tom Allen could do to catch his wife while shouting at Margaret to go change Ness at once. Margaret rushed her into the back room and left in search of field clothes, and Ness stood in the center of that room, running her hands along her body, reveling in her ugly nakedness. She knew it was the intricate scars on her bare shoulders that had alarmed them all. But the scars weren't just there. No. Her scarred skin was like another body in and of itself, shaped like a man hugging her from behind, with his arms hanging around her neck. They went up from her breasts, rounded the hills of her shoulders, and traveled the full, proud length of her back. They licked the top of her buttocks before trailing away into nothing. Ness's skin was no longer really skin, more like the ghost of her past, made seeable, physical. She didn't mind the reminder. Margaret came back in the room with a headscarf, a brown top that covered the shoulders, a red skirt that went all the way to the floor. She watched Ness put them on. It's a shame, really. For a second, I thought you might have been prettier than me. She clucked her tongue twice and left the room. And so Ness worked in the field. It was not new to her. In hell, she had worked the land too. In hell, the sun scorched cotton so hot it almost burned the palms of your hands to touch it. Holding those small white puffs almost felt like holding fire, but God forbid you let one drop. The devil was always watching. Hell was where she had learned to be a good field hand, and the skill had carried her all the way to Tuscumbia. It was her second month at the Stockham plantation. She lived in one of the women's cabins, but she had made no friends. Everyone knew her as the woman who had snubbed Tim Tam, and the ladies, angry when they thought she was the object of his desire, and even angrier when they realized she didn't want to be that object, treated her as though she were little more than a strong wind, an annoyance that you could still push through. In the mornings, Ness prepared her pail to take out to the field with her, cornmeal cakes, a bit of salt pork, and if she was lucky, some greens. In hell, she had learned to eat standing up, picking cotton with her right hand, shoveling food in with her left. It wasn't something she was required to do here at Tom Allen's, work while eating, but she didn't know any other way. Look like she thinks she better than us, one woman called, just loudly enough so Ness could hear. Tom Allen sure won't think so, another said. Nuh-uh, Tom Allen ain't paid her no mind since she got kicked out the big house, the first one said. Ness had learned how to tune the voices out. She tried to remember the tree that Esi used to speak to her, tried to still her mind until all that was left was the thin, stern line of her mother's lips, lips that used to usher out words of love in a tongue that Ness could no longer quite grasp. Phrases and words came to her, mismatched or lopsided, wrong. She worked all day like this, listening to the sounds of the South, the insistent buzz of mosquitoes, that screech of cicadas, the hum of slave gossip. At night, she would return to her quarters, beat out her palette until dust billowed from it, wrapping around her like a hug. She would set it back down again and wait for a sleep that rarely came, trying her best to still the harrowing images that danced behind her closed eyelids. It was on a night like this, just when she had snapped her palette into the air, that the pounding started, fists beating against the door of the women's cabin in a steady, urgent rhythm. Please, a voice called. Please help us. A woman named Mavis opened the door. Tim Tam stood there, cradling his daughter Pinky in his arms. He pushed into the room, his voice choked, though there were no tears in his eyes. I think she got what her mama had, he said. The women cleared a spot for the girl, and Tim Tam set her down before he started to pace. Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord, he cried. You best go fetch the doctor, Ruthie said. Doctor ain't helped last time, Tim Tam said. Ness stood behind a row of women, their shoulders squared as if headed into battle. She pushed her way through to the center to catch a glimpse of the child. Pinky was small and sharp-edged, as though her body were built from sticks with no bend to them. Her hair was tied in two big puffs. The whole time the women were watching her, she made no noise, save for a quick intake of breath. Ain't nothing wrong with her, Ness said. Suddenly, Tim Tam stopped his pacing as everyone turned to stare at Ness. You ain't been round here long, Tim Tam said. Pinky ain't spoke a word since her mama died, and now she can't stop with these hiccups. Ain't nothing but the hiccups, Ness said. Those ain't killed anyone yet, far as I know. She looked around at all the women, shaking their heads at her disapprovingly, but she couldn't tell what she had done wrong. Tim Tam pulled her aside. These women ain't told you? He whispered, and Ness shook her head. The women so rarely spoke to her, and she had finally gotten good at tuning out their gossip. Tim Tam cleared his throat, hung his head a little lower. See, we know ain't nothing wrong with her but the hiccups, but we've been trying to get her to speak, so... His voice trailed off as Ness began to understand that the whole thing had been nothing more than a plot to trick little Pinky into utterance. Ness pulled away from Tim Tam and looked at the small congregation of women carefully, from one to the next, and then the next. She made her way to the center of the room where Pinky lay on the pallet, her eyes staring up at the ceiling. The girl turned her eyes toward Ness and hiccuped once more. Ness addressed the room. Lord, I don't know what kind of foolishness I done walked into at this here plantation, but y'all need to leave this girl alone. Maybe she don't want to speak 'cause she know how crazy it make you, or maybe she ain't got nothing to say yet, but I reckon she ain't gonna start talking tonight just because y'all making like actors in a traveling show. The women wrung their hands and shifted their feet, and Tim Tam's head sunk a little lower. Ness walked back to her pallet, finished beating the dust out, and lay down. Tim Tam walked over to Pinky. Well, let's go, he said, reaching for the girl, but she pulled away. I said, let's go, he repeated, shame coloring his voice gray. But the girl snatched herself away again. She went over to where Ness lay, her eyes shut tightly as she begged sleep to come quick. Pinky's hand brushed Ness's shoulder, and she opened her eyes to see the girl staring at her, round moon eyes imploring. And because Ness understood loss, and because she understood motherlessness and wanting and even silence, she reached for the girl's hand and pulled her down into the bed. You go on ahead, she said to Tim Tam, Pinky's head already nestled between the soft cushions of her breasts. I got her tonight. From that day forward, Pinky could not be separated from Ness. She had even moved from the other woman's cabin into Ness's. She slept with Ness, ate with Ness, took walks with Ness, and cooked with Ness. Still, she didn't speak, and Ness never asked her to, knowing full well that Pinky would speak when she had something to say, laugh when something was truly funny. For her part, Ness, who had not known how much she missed company, took comfort in the girl's quiet presence. Pinky was the water girl. On any given day, she would make as many as 40 trips down to the small creek on the edge of the Stockham plantation. She carried a plank of wood across her back, arms folded over it from behind so that she looked like a man holding a cross, and on each end of the plank hung 2 silver pails. Once she reached the creek, Pinky would fill those pails, bring them back to the main room, and then empty them into the large water buckets that lived on the Stockham porch. She would fill the basins in the house so that the Stockham children would have fresh water for their afternoon baths. She would water the flowers that sat on Susan Stockham's dressing table. From there, she went to the kitchen to give 2 pailfuls to Margaret for the day's cooking. She walked the same worn path every day, down to the creek, back up to the house. By the end of the day, her arms would throb so hard Ness could feel her heartbeat in them when the girl crawled into bed with Ness at night and the woman hugged her close. The hiccups had not stopped, continuing since the day Tim Tam had brought her into Ness's cabin, hoping to scare the child into speaking. Everyone pitched in with a remedy. Stand a girl upside down. Tell her hold her breath and swallow. Cross 2 straws on top her head. The last remedy, put forth by a woman named Harriet, was the one that seemed to work. Pinky made 34 trips to the creek without a single hiccup. Ness was on the porch, getting her fill of water on Pinky's 35th trip back. The 2 red-headed Stockham children were out and about that day. The boy, named Tom Jr., and the girl, Mary. They were running up the stairs just as Pinky rounded the corner, and Tom Jr. knocked the plank so that one of the pails went flying into the air, water raining down on everyone on the porch. Mary started to cry. My dress is all wet, she said. Margaret, who had just finished ladling out water for one of the other slaves, set the ladle down. Hush now, Miss Mary. Tom Jr., who had never been much for gallantry, decided to try it just then for his sister's sake. Well, apologize to Mary, he said to Pinky. The 2 were the same age, though Pinky was about a foot taller. Pinky opened her mouth, but no words came out. She's sorry, Ness said quickly. I wasn't talking to you, Tom Jr. said. Mary had stopped crying and was staring at Pinky intently. Tom, you know she don't talk, Mary said. It's all right, Pinky. She'll talk if I tell her to talk, Tom Jr. said, shoving his sister. Apologize to Mary, he repeated. The sun was high and hot that day. Indeed, Ness could see that the 2 wet drops on Mary's dress had already dried. Pinky, eyes welling with tears, opened her mouth again, and a wave of hiccups came out, frantic and loud. Tom Jr. shook his head. He went into the house while everyone watched and returned with the Stockham cane. It was twice his length, made of a dull birch wood. It wasn't thick, but it was so heavy that Tom Jr. could hardly hold it with both of his hands, let alone the one it would take to snap it back. Speak, nigger, Tom Jr. said, and Margaret, who had long since stopped her ladling, ran into the house crying, Ooh, Tom Jr., I'm gonna find your daddy. Pinky was sobbing and hiccuping all at once, the hiccups blocking whatever speech she might have given. Tom Jr. lifted the cane in his right hand with great effort and tried to snap it over his shoulder, but Ness, who was standing behind him, caught the tip of it in her hand. It tore through her palms as she tugged so hard that Tom Jr. fell to the ground. She dragged him half an inch. Tom Allen appeared on the porch with Margaret, who was breathless and clutching her chest. What's this? He asked. Tom Jr. started crying. She was gonna hit me, Daddy, he said. Margaret tried to speak up. Massa Tom, you lie, you was... Tom Allen raised his hand to stop Margaret's speech and looked at Ness. Maybe he remembered the scars on her shoulders, remembered how they had kept his wife laid up in bed for the rest of that day and put him off his dinner for a week. Maybe he wondered what a nigger had to do to earn stripes like that, what trouble a nigger like that must be capable of. And there his son was on the ground with dirt on his shorts and the mute child Pinky crying. Ness was sure that he could see clear as day what had happened, but it was the memory of her scars that made him doubt. A nigger with scars like that and his son on the ground. There wasn't anything else he could do. "I'll deal with you soon enough," he said to Ness, and everyone wondered what would happen. That evening, Ness returned to the women's quarters. She crawled into her bed and closed her eyes, waiting for the images that played every night behind her lids to still to darkness. Beside her, Pinky began to hiccup. "Oh Lord, here she go. Ain't we had enough trouble for one day?" one of the women said. "Can't get no kind of rest when this girl start to hiccup." Ashamed, Pinky slapped a hand to her mouth, as though with it she could erect a wall to block the sound's escape. "Don't pay them no mind," Ness whispered. "Thinking about it only gonna make it worse." She didn't know if she was speaking to Pinky or to herself. Pinky squeezed her eyes tight as a series of hiccups exploded from her lips. "Leave her be," Ness said to the chorus of groans, and they listened. The events of the day had planted a little dual seed of respect and pity for Ness that they watered with deference of their own. They didn't know what Tom Allen was going to do. In the night, once they had all finally reached sleep, Pinky rolled over and snuggled into the soft skin of Ness's gut. Ness allowed herself to hold the girl, and she allowed herself to drift into memory. She is back in hell. She is married to a man they call Sam, but who comes straight from the continent and speaks no English. The master of hell, the devil himself with red leather skin and a shock of gray hair, prefers his slaves married for reasons of insurance. And because Ness is new to hell, and because no one has claimed her, she is given to calm the new slave, Sam. At first, they do not speak to each other. Ness doesn't understand his strange tongue, and she is in awe of him, for he is the most beautiful man that she has ever seen, with skin so dark and creamy that looking at it could very well be the same thing as tasting it. His is the large, muscular body of the African beast, and he refuses to be caged, even with Ness as his welcoming gift. Ness knows that the devil must have paid a great deal of money for him, and therefore expects hard work, but nothing anyone does seems to tame him. On his first day, he fights with another slave, spits on the overseer, and is stood on a platform and whipped in front of everyone until the blood on the ground is high enough to bathe a baby. Sam refuses to learn English. Each night, in retribution for his still black tongue, the devil sends him back to their marriage bed with lashes that are reopened as soon as they heal. One night, enraged, Sam destroys the slave quarters. Their room is savaged from wall to wall, and when the devil hears of the destruction, he comes to serve punishment. "I did it," Ness says. She has spent the night hidden in the left corner of the room, watching this man she's been told is her husband become the animal he's been told that he is. The devil shows no mercy, even though he knows she is lying. Even though Sam tries time and again to accept the blame, she is beaten until the whip snaps off her back like pulled taffy, and then she is kicked to the ground. When he leaves, Sam is crying and Ness is barely conscious. Sam's words come out in a thick and feverish prayer, and Ness can't understand what he's saying. He picks her up gingerly and places her on their pallet. He leaves the house in search of the herbal doctor 5 miles away, who comes back with the roots and leaves and salves that are smeared into Ness's back as she slips in and out of consciousness. It is the first night that Sam sleeps in the cot with her, and in the morning, when she wakes up to fresh pain and festered sores, she finds him sitting at her feet, peering at her face with his big, tired eyes. "I'm sorry," he says. They are the first English words he ever speaks to her, to anyone. That week, they work side by side in the fields, and the devil, though watchful, does not act against him. In the evenings, they return to their bed, but they sleep on opposite sides of it, never touching. Some nights, they fear that the devil is watching them as they lie, and those are the nights Sam hugs her body to his, waiting for the metronome of fear that keeps her heart's drumbeat moving quickly to slow. His vocabulary has grown to include her name and his, don't worry, and quiet. In a month, he will learn love. In a month, once the wounds on both of their backs have hardened to scars, they finally consummate their marriage. He picks her up so easily, she thinks she must have turned into one of the rag dolls she makes for the children to play with. She has never been with a man before, but she imagines that Sam is not a man. For her, he has become something much larger than a man, the Tower of Babel itself, so close to God that it must be toppled. He runs his hands along her scabby back, and she does the same along his. And as they work together, clutching each other, some scars reopen. They are both bleeding now, both bride and bridegroom, in this unholy, holy union. Breath leaves his mouth and enters hers, and they lie together until the roosters crow, until it's time to return to the fields. Ness awoke to Pinky's finger poking her shoulder. Ness, Ness, she spoke. Ness turned to face the girl, trying to hide her surprise. Was you having a bad dream? She asked. No, Ness said. It looked like you was having a bad dream, the girl said, disappointed because when she was lucky, Ness told her stories. It was bad, Ness replied, but it wasn't no dream. That's it. Thank you.
Mesmerizing. I felt I saw such imagery. I saw a nest, I saw a plantation, you know, the whole scene with the kids and everything. I wanted to ask, when you were first conceiving this story, you know, what was your process? How did you go from idea to published novel? Like, you know, because I'm thinking about writing a book, and I have plenty of ideas for stories, but I have trouble with execution. So how did you get from idea to execution to what you have now?
Sure. So this book started for me. I took a trip to Ghana the summer after my sophomore year, and I visited the Cape Coast Castle. And it was on that tour of the castle that the guide told us about how sometimes the British soldiers who lived and worked in this castle would marry the local women, which was something that I had never heard before. I'd never really thought about the ways in which the Ghanaians might have been engaging with the British in that way. And then he took us down to see the dungeons, and I was really struck by the idea that there could be, you know, Gold Coast women up above who weren't aware of exactly what would become of the women in the dungeons below. And so it kind of started for me with this juxtaposition of these two women, the wife of the British governor and the slave. But it took a while for me to figure out how to put that into, you know, novel form. I probably worked on this book for 7 years total. The first 3 years were a mess. Just like, probably had like 100 pages that I threw out entirely. And then I started over again once I got to Iowa. And there I wrote the first 2 chapters pretty freely, and they are basically the same as they appear in this book. And then after that, I made a family tree that I put on the wall. And the family tree just had the name of the character, their gender if I knew it, the time period during which the bulk of their chapter would take place in, and then one thing that was happening politically, historically in the background during that time period. So like the advent of cocoa farming in Ghana or the Great Migration. And then I wrote chronologically, and I would begin each section just kind of researching whatever that thing was in the background, just enough to spark my imagination. And once I had that, I would try to write. I strove for about 400 words a day, which is a small goal. Like, I know a lot of writers who write like 10 pages a day, but 400 was a good number for me because I usually didn't reach it, and then I wouldn't feel so bad, you know, if I didn't get there. And then if I exceeded it, I would feel like I did a really great job that day. And so that was kind of how I worked for the next like 3.5 years. Yeah.
I'm curious, I know you worked on your book a long time, and the timing is interesting because there are at least 3 movies out now about slavery. So I'm wondering if that is a good thing, you know, for you as your book is being talked about a lot in various circles.
Yeah.
Because this is tough stuff, and a lot of people don't want to deal with it. So you got underground going on, you have the roots revival, and then this Free State film that's coming out pretty soon. It's just pretty interesting timing for your book.
Yeah, it is. There was no way to know when I started this book that this was the climate that it would be coming out into. But one thing that I always wanted to do with this book was to make sure that it ended in the present, so that we could see the way that the effects of slavery have lingered, what the legacy, has left all of us now. And so I think it's really interesting that all of these movies and books are kind of popping up around the topic, because I think it's making people have to kind of think about what we've inherited. And I'm happy for this book to come out and kind of be a part of that conversation.
When I listen to you read your book, I hear a kind of melody, as if you have some music in the background that you kind of absorb.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something musical that you combine with your work? Is it just
Yeah, there's not really. I do read all of my work aloud. I've probably read this entire book to myself aloud like 100 times. I like to do that for editing purposes, because I have a hard time catching my mistakes when I just read it. So that's kind of how it started. And then after a while, I started doing it just because I liked being able to listen to how the words sounded together. And it kind of helped if I needed to, add a phrase here or extend a line there. And so I'm kind of used to knowing what my work sounds like when it's spoken aloud, which is nice because it makes readings easier also.
Which of the characters, in terms of the literary process and the psychological process for yourself, was the most difficult and challenging?
Yeah, the character that was easily the most challenging was Quay's chapter. He's the third chapter in the book. And he's the son of the British governor and the Cape Coast Castle and the Fante woman that this governor marries. And that chapter was difficult because I was having a lot of trouble finding any information, any research text around what became of these children. I knew they existed. I'd read like a piece in a book here or there that said that they would sometimes be sent to England for school and then came back and kind of started to form Ghana's middle class. But there wasn't very much information about them. And it was the only time during writing this book that I felt really stifled by the research. Like, I just felt like I couldn't write unless I knew more. And so I ended up actually having to skip his chapter and go on to Nessa's chapter, and then kind of come back to it when I felt a little more ready. And even then, it was like not a great chapter in the first draft. And it's the only chapter that I cut and rewrote completely just from scratch, just to kind of allow myself to not put as much pressure on it and to free myself up and let myself rely on imagination more than research.
Yeah, what about psychologically?
Psychologically, I don't know. They're all kind of difficult psychologically. I don't know. Some of the ones, Esi's chapter takes place in the dungeon, which is a hard space to really kind of imagine yourself in, like I don't know what it feels like to be in a dark room for months at a time. And the people who were kept in these rooms didn't ever get a chance to tell their own stories, so it wasn't like I could approach it from their own words. And so I think, so many of these moments I just kind of, had to kind of try to deeply imagine what it might feel like to be in some of these really harrowing situations.
I'm guessing there's a difference between being in the throes of writing a book and the book being out in the world. So what is your relationship to the book now that it is out in the world?
That's a good question. Well, in the throes of writing, I'd say I didn't really feel like anyone was ever going to read this book when I was writing it, It was just kind of for me to kind of think through a lot of these questions that I had always had, questions about identity and diaspora and kind of what connects Africans and African Americans and, the threat of slavery. And this book felt very personal and very private. And then obviously I started to workshop parts of it in school and started to show it to other people. So I started to understand that it might have an audience later on. But now this has all been incredibly crazy and really great. But also, it's I've had to kind of switch spaces a little bit because I'm so used to being, this, introverted person who just sits at her desk all day writing, and now I'm in rooms like this in front of a lot of people. Thank you. But yeah, it's a different skill set, and it's not one I think that a lot of writers think about when they're just working quietly at their desk, that this is somewhere that they might end up. So, I'm new at it, and I'm trying to learn what to do and how to make it work as best as I can.
So I'm curious about the African side of this story. What sort of research material is out there on, historically, and what sort of materials did you use when you were writing the stories?
Yeah, so I went to the castle, which was incredibly helpful. If you ever get a chance to take that tour, I really recommend it. It's a great tour, and totally devastating. And then I started with a book called The Door of No Return by William St. Clair. He kind of did a lot of the groundwork for me. He'd already taken all of the archival research about the castle and kind of compiled it into this book that talked about life in and around the castle during the time period that I'm writing about. So he had a chapter on the women, a chapter on the children, and then also just kind of the layout of the castle. There was another book called The Fante and the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Rebecca Shumway that talked about the Fante people's involvement in slavery. That was really helpful for those earlier chapters. Yeah, I used a lot of different books that are listed in the acknowledgement page of this novel, but it was, it's a kind of research that, because there's so little firsthand account from the Ghanaian side of things, the British brought the written language with them, and so there aren't a lot of texts from the Ghanaian perspective. I really had a chance, I felt, to kind of open up my imagination and write freely, while also trying to hold myself accountable to these people who might have been experiencing these things. So it was this double thing of research and also just kind of freedom.
What do you think is the most healthy thing that people should sort of keep in mind or going forward think about having to do with this?
Yeah. The thing that writing this book that has made me think about more is the fact that all of these moments in history, these really traumatic things that we talk about, they didn't happen to some nameless, faceless mass, They happened to people like us, individuals like us who had hopes like we have and fears, and were trying to do the best they could for their children, and all the same motivations that we have, they have. And so this book is kind of an attempt to show the individuals who are stuck in these extraordinary circumstances, and to bring them to the foreground, and to let us feel them and see them fully as people, and not as just like a clump in the middle of slavery.
Who are some of your favorite authors that you enjoy reading? And thank you for doing this. I understand about being introverted and speaking in front of you. You're doing awesome.
Thank you. So I read 100 Years of Solitude before writing this book, which is a great book if you haven't read it, and also just a great book if you're about to write a pretty big, messy family novel. Writers I love, Toni Morrison has been huge for me. Song of Solomon is one of my favorite books. James Baldwin is also a huge hero of mine. I grew up Pentecostal in Alabama, and I just love reading anything he writes about religion. Edward P. Jones, Jhumpa Lahiri. I have a lot of heroes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the cover of the book. It's very dynamic and interesting, and there are lots of primary colors. How did that come to be, the cover?
Sure. I'll let you in on a little secret, which is that the author does not really get any say in the cover of their book. I didn't talk to anybody beforehand. This is the first cover that I saw, and lucky for me, I really liked it. And the designer, I think, did a great job of thinking about, both, what the book means, and kind of, I think after you read the book, the cover kind of becomes more rich, and symbolically rich. And it's also just, I think, one of those covers that arrests you and makes you want to stop and pick it up, so I feel like I lucked out. But yeah, writers don't get much say on the covers.
What about the title?
The title is mine, yeah. I did get a say on the title. Homegoing traditionally is a term used for African American funerals, slave funerals, the idea being that once you died, your spirit got to return to the country from which you were stolen. And so I felt like that was the most symbolically rich title that I could use for a novel that was trying to connect the African and African American experience. Thank you.
I wasn't in the radiology suite wearing my scrubs and white coat. I was dressed in a patient's gown, tethered to an IV pole, using the computer the nurse had left in my hospital room with my wife Lucy, an internist, at my side.